This is an example one for default arguments. So we have to write a function that calculates and prints on the console the gross pay of an employee. And this employee is hourly paid employee. And for that, we need two variables. One variable for the hours the employee worked and one variable for the pay rate, how much money is paid for every hour they worked. So, and these two variables, the values we are going to get from the user. So std cout, enter hours worked by an employee. Std cin, let's say hours. And let's define this variable. It's going to be integer. You can make it double if you want. So the next one is we want the value for pay rate. Enter pay rate. Std cin, and let's say pay rate. And let's define this as well. Let's make it double. So pay rate. And now I want one more value, and it's going to be the ID of an employee. So let's say int emp ID and std cout, enter ID of an employee. Std cin and emp ID. So now let's write a function that is going to calculate and print out on the console the result. So I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to use void. You can use any return type you want. So in this example, I'm going to use void. And let's write a name of a function. Let's say show pay. And since we have three arguments, we are going to use three parameters. The first one is going to be employee ID, employee ID. The second one is going to be integer for hours, and the last one will be double for pay rate. Let's say PR. And std cout, let's say gross pay for employee, the ID with ID with ID with ID emp ID is so what is going to be the gross pay? It's hours multiplied by pay rate. So hours multiplied by pay rate, PR, std end line. So we have to now call this function show pay, and the variables that we have created, we are going to pass them as arguments. The first one is employee ID, and the second one is hours worked, and the third one is pay rate. Okay, let's write the prototype of this function, the return type, the name of a function, and the parameters, the data types of each parameter we used. So first one is integer for employee ID, the second one is integer for hours, and the third one, the last one, is double for the pay rate. So when I run this program, let's say it's asking me to enter hours worked by an employee, let's say 40, enter pay rate, let's say 22.55, enter ID, enter 3. So as you can see, gross pay for employee with ID 123 is $902. Let's make it dollars. So since we are working, and since this is an example for default arguments, now let's apply them. Let's see how they work. And we know that default arguments are defined in the prototype. So equals sign or assigned operator and the value. For example, hours worked 15, and this is going to be the second default argument. For the pay rate, let's make it, for example, $30 for every hour the employee worked. And when I run this program, let's remember what default argument is. If we leave out the actual arguments, then the default arguments will be used. And since we have here all arguments and we are passing all these variables as argument, so the compiler is not going to take these values. So let's run the program and see. Enter hours worked by an employee, let's say 50. Enter pay rate, let's say $60, and enter ID 123. And as you can see, even though you have here default arguments, it's going to take the values that the user entered. User entered 50, user entered 60, user entered 123. Okay, and the multiplication of 50 by 60 is 3000. So now I am going to leave out this two arguments, the argument for hours and the argument of pay rate. Now I have only one argument, and this is the employee ID. And even though the program is going to ask the values for hours and pay rate, it's going to take and calculate and multiply 15 by 30. Why? Because we don't have here, we left out the arguments for the hours and the argument for pay rate. Okay, that's why it's going to take default arguments. So let's run the program. Enter hours worked by an employee, let's say 50, enter pay rate 50, enter ID 123. As you can see, gross pay for employee with ID 123 is 450. Why? Actually, we have to have 2500, but we have 450 because since we left out the arguments for hours and pay rate, it's going to take the values of default arguments, and they are 15 and 30. Next thing that I want to mention is that, so when a function uses a mixture of parameters with and without default arguments, the parameters with the default arguments must be defined last. Otherwise, it's going to be an illegal prototype, which obviously will not be allowed. So if you want to specify the first argument, okay, for example, MP ID, but you want to leave the second argument and specify the third, the last argument. For example, let's say just pay rate, okay, or you can give any value. Instead of pay rate, you can give 90, any value you want. So when we run this program, since it's not acceptable, let me run and show you. It's not acceptable. So basically, if you leave out one argument, then you have to leave out the rest as well, just like this. Or default arguments must be specified last. So when I run this program, it's working perfectly fine.